Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing fine. So, we are going to continue our class on criticism and theory unlocked. So, previously, what we did is uh, we did something, it was romanticism. So, in previous classes, we had talked about starting from classical criticism, then we had Renaissance criticism, and we talked about neoclassical criticism, right, and also romantic criticism. So, today is the fifth section where we are going to discuss Victorian criticism and where we will unlock all these important terms starting from realism, naturalism, symbolism, magic realism, aestheticism, and they are all in order, right? And also we'll talk about Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Okay, and we'll just move on to Thomas Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Edgar Allan Poe, Matthew Arnold, and Hippolyte Taine. You know this name because of what? Virginia Woolf, right? And Friedrich Nietzsche, Leo Tolstoy also. They all talked about criticism in some way or the other. So fine, shall we begin the class? Anyone who is there, just say hi in the chat box. Then we will begin our class on Victorian criticism. I am happy and also I'm very excited about it. I hope you will like the class. Anyway, we'll begin with realism. Okay, so this word you have come across like many times, right? And what is realism? But before that, we'll have just little bit look on what is Victorian criticism. So what usually happened there at that time in Victorian criticism? So that Victorian age was something like massive social and political changes occurred during the 19th century, right? And it was an era of nationalism and imperialism, right? And the important event was the Industrial Revolution, and these areas were what becoming centers of manufacturing and commerce. So basically this age is all dominated by what? This Industrial Revolution, imperialism, and nationalism, right? That's great. So according to Hegel, the first one that we'll talk about, I think it was in at the end. Anyway, according to Hegel, what is Bourgeois thought is a predominant but one-sided component of larger scheme that includes romanticism and religion. So this period, these major movement happened, starting with realism. Then we became more real by naturalism. Then we had symbolism, and eventually we had aestheticism, right? So this is all in Victorian criticism. In Victorian age this all happened, right? We'll begin with realism. So when realism comes, you should remember one motto, one key thing is there, that the faithful representation of reality. So that is the backbone, or everything is about realism. So remember that the faithful representation of reality, right? And then in naturalism is that sometime realism is not, we wanted to be more what? More real means more natural, right? So then we had naturalism. So here we are talking about realism. So realism is the faithful representation of reality. So realism refers to attempting to represent the subject matter truthfully without artificiality. There should be, so realism what supports? It says that it should represent what? The subject matter truthfully without what? Artificiality and speculative fiction or supernatural element, right? This is, remember, this is all after romanticism. That's why this thing is mentioned, supernatural element. I hope you got the point. So realism here is a movement in art history that began where? In France after the French Revolution 1848, right? So realism was motivated by a renewed interest in common people and the emergence of leftist politics. And the realism is a way for individuals to discover the truth through senses. So realism also supports the truth through their senses. So it has roots in where? Descartes and the Locke, and was formulated for the first time in 18th century by Thomas Reid. So remember these important names. We'll just move quickly. An artist like Gustave Courbet, capitalizing on the mundane, ugly or sordid. And remember, in Russian we have Anton Chekhov, who used what? Camera works to reproduce an uninflicted slice of life. Correct? And remember that in Russia, Anton Chekhov and realistic theatricality, rhetoric and persuasive quality. Fine. And in English, in Britain is who? Henry James, Wilhelm Dean Howells. These were in English, so they represented realism in their work. Henry James, Wilhelm Dean Howells. So that way these names are important, because sometime even in previous exams they have asked about realism, and also we had to sort it out which one who belongs to realism. So that kind of questions we already faced. So anyway, that served as the spokesman for realism, articulated its aesthetic principle. So realist painter rejected romanticism, right? That's why it is the next movement, right, after romanticism. So obviously these realist painters rejected the theme of romanticism. So the paintings presented a slice of life, right, detached from all moral, emotional and aesthetic considerations. So there are two ways literary critics apply the concept of realism. Is that during the 19th century, a literary movement include what? Henri de Balzac in France, our George Eliot in England, and William Dean Howells in America. So there is a recurrent mode of representing life and experience in literature in various eras and literary forms. Fine. And realist author includes, remember these are quite important. You will find realism in Thackeray, Dickens, of course. He represented what? In his work, in his novel, The Life in Victorian Era. So Anthony Trollope, George Eliot and our Thomas Hardy, where you will see realism in Tess of the D'Urbervilles and also the Mayor of the Casterbridge. So their work addressed political, social, religious concerns relevant to 19th century England. Fine. That's great. Then we had naturalism. So naturalism is what? It is the extreme part of what? Realism. So naturalism referred the study of the nature or the human nature, and is often perceived as extreme form of realism. So remember, extreme form of realism is what? Naturalism. So naturalism what happens there? It is an approach to literature that draws on the principle of causality, explanation, determination, and experimentation. And these naturalist writers, what they usually observes man and his passions, right? And the man believes that events and actions arise from specific causes. In the 19th century, naturalism emerged as a literary movement that rejected romanticism. So naturalism is also realism, but extreme form of realism. Fine. Great. So it was distinct in its embrace of determination, detachment, scientific objection, and social commentary. So in realism, we had George Eliot, right? Thomas Hardy was there, Thackeray was there. And in naturalism, everything started with what? With this movement traces its roots primarily to the what? Theories of French Emile Zola. So Emile Zola, where this term we got to know, we found this term in Emile Zola's The Experimental Novel 1880. That question come. So remember that point also. So it presents Zola's idea about a naturalistic novel with philosophical roots, where starting with Auguste Comte's positivism. Right? Remember, positivism and post-positivism is what? Positivism was like, the strong belief, like after that there is nothing. They don't, that concrete truth. But in post positivism, what happened? Whatever is true right now, it can change over time. So post positivism is like they welcome new thoughts. There can be change. Everything is not concrete now, but it can change, maybe with a different perspective. So post positivism is that, and positivism is the strong belief, right? So like your human nature or natural order. Historian Hippolyte and physiologist Claude Bernard also comes under the naturalism. So the scientific method proposed by Comte that went beyond empiricism and passive observation of phenomena. So Zola, according to Zola argued that naturalism should function in literature as controlled experiments. And another naturalist we had is the Frank Norris, who was primarily a naturalist. Norris placed realism, romanticism, and of course naturalism in opposition to each other, with romanticism opposing realism. Fine. So Norris' definition of naturalism is devoid of materialistic determinism or other philosophical notion. So Hardy's Jude has the obscure has the element of naturalism there, and Eugene O'Neill's play, majority of his plays are based on also naturalism. And one of the important one, Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, which is set during World War II, also represent naturalism. So it can also be seen in ironic comedy of manners in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Excellent example. In exam they will only ask the important one is which has completely made for naturalism. So that is Emile Zola's Nana. What? Nana 1880. And another naturalist is there, Theodore Dreiser, An American Tragedy 1925. Fine. So expressionism, symbolism initially opposed realism, Naturalism, that is all about expressionism. We'll just talk about later. But anyway, the author you should remember is Stephen Crane, naturalism. Jack London, naturalist. Theodore Dreiser, Frank Norris, William Dean Howells, Henry James. And they were all clearly on the realist or naturalist side. Now we have symbolism. What is symbolism? So the development of symbolism was a reaction to realism, naturalism. So this is all what reaction of realism and naturalism, and the Parnassian movement, which attempted to develop a precise, definitive language. So Baudelaire, when the symbolism comes, you should remember first it comes from French, right? French symbolism. And who's the founder? Baudelaire. Baudelaire, one work is there, Les Fleurs or something. So symbolism occurred in 19th century France, Russia and Belgium. So it depicts what? The symbol of truths, symbol of metaphorical images. So French poets founded a loosely organized literary and artistic movement known as symbolism. We'll just move straight to the important point. Remember the work? Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. That was the name, which was published in 1857. Remember the date, why it is important in Indian history? Something happened, right? So that through that you can also remember what? Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. Fine. So Baudelaire's admiration and translation of Edgar Allan Poe, and this Edgar Allan Poe is my favorite, not because of his poetry, but because of his short stories. So if you read Edgar Allan Poe, it's just amazing, like magnificent. It just like his works and his stories are something, the unity of what? Unity of not action but emotions, kind of. So that is quite a good work of, whatever you read about Edgar Allan Poe, whatever his short stories are, all are like extremely well written. Unity of effect, that's what I was talking about. So Edgar Allan Poe's work had a significant impact and provided a source for many stock tropes in images. Stephen Mallarmé, another symbolist, and also Paul Verlaine. Remember these names: Charles Baudelaire, Stephen Mallarmé, and Paul Verlaine. Fine. That's good. So a series of manifestos articulated the aesthetic in the 1880s, attracting a generation of writers. So in the 19th century, Jean Maurice coined the term, distinguished between the symbolist of literature and art in the decadence. So the principal, just remember the name, Charles Baudelaire, and his work Les Fleurs du Mal, 1857. Stephen Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, Edgar Allan Poe, Yeats Byzantium, Eliot's The Wasteland, Hart Crane's The Bridge, Wallace Stevens is what? The Comedian, as Let Us See, Dylan Thomas series of sonnet, Alterwise by Owl Light, James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. According to M.H. Abraham, symbolism influenced poets such as Arthur Symons, Ernest Dawson, W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, Dylan Thomas, Hart Crane, E. Cummings, and what? Wallace Stevens. Great. So that was our. Another is magic realism, that we always come across that thing, right? And we remember two person. One, Midnight Children, right? Salman Rushdie, and another is Latin American writer Lorca is there. So magic realism, 20th century style fiction and literary genre. It is eponymous genre painting style influenced the term in the 1920s. So what happens? Magic realism usually depict the modern world as realistically as possible, and it also adds magical elements dealing with fantasy and reality. It refers literary works presenting magic or supernatural element as a part of real world setting, such as a novel or a dramatic performance. So we just move to this George Louis Borges and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, Gunter Grass, Italo Calvino, John Fawkes. These all used what? Magic realism in their work. And also, if you are talking about diaspora, we have Salman Rushdie, and also one African American is also there. So with sharp etching of realism, they interweave ordinary events. It describes details with fantastic and dreamlike element. Fine. So characteristics of magical realism or magic realism is what happens there. Magic realism depicts fantastical events using a realistic style. Fables, folk tales, myth have become relevant to contemporary life. Magic realism is based on fantastic element in the real world. Remember the name Gabriel Garcia Marquez evokes this style in his 100 Years of Solitude. Okay, now we have aestheticism. Aestheticism is what you should remember, that term, that motto for the aestheticism or doctrine of art for art's sake. And it rejects all moral, political, and didactic reason for creating and consuming art for art's sake, right? For the sake of art. And in for art, where this term came from, Walter Pater, right? He credited this term, coining this phrase, art for art's sake, right? And Pater suggests that artistic autonomy and the fact that experience is constantly in flux. So now we come, this resulted in the rejection of John Ruskin's Matthew Arnold, George MacDonald, and we have conception of art as being moral as usual. So art for the sake of truth. So anyway, in Britain, the best representatives of aestheticism is Oscar Wilde, Swinburne, James McNeill, Whistler, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And remember that aestheticism, this Punch, the magazine, was founded by Henry Mahive, Ebenezer Landels in 1841. This is especially for aestheticism. Now we'll just talk about Hegel, George Wilhelm Hegel, why he's important. As we know, he's a German philosopher, and he's the most influenced figure in the history of German idealism. And we'll just why his fame rests on these two works, the phenomenology of a spirit and the science of logic. So the philosophical system of Hegel's is divided into three parts. So logic, the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of spirit. Fine. So he gave the lecture and everything started from here. As we know that how we are studying, we are starting from the beginning, like where aestheticism, we all know about Walter Pater, right? We all know about Oscar Wilde. But how it began, where it started all, so that was all from this. Lectures on Aesthetics. By who? By George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Just remember that name. You only have to remember, that's all. It is not quite important for your exam point of view. Okay, so the book was a which compilation of notes from lectures on aesthetics in Heidelberg and Berlin in 1818. So we'll just move to the idea, what is there. So the idea is developed throughout the lecture, and the first universal part is concerned with the concept of the artistic ideal. The second particular part focuses on how this ideal is realized in 3 stages. 1. Symbolic art was understood to encompass everything before classical Greek art, then classical art. The emergence of what romantic art has been attributed to the advent of Christianity on the global stage. So the third singular part examined 5 significant arts: architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry. Now here we come to the important part of aestheticism, which is especially important to our exam point of view, right? That Walter Pater is famous for what? Studies in the history of Renaissance. So it was revised, the Renaissance studies in art and poetry. Remember this name, right? And he described his approach to art and advocated the ideal of an intentional life, which many took as manifesto. Art for art's sake. Remember, Pater critiqued a specific Renaissance artist or poet. He emphasized the importance of embracing the beauty and experience of art rather than judging a work of art by its accuracy or the moral standing of the artist. Fine. Oscar Wilde. Now, major aesthetic critic is here. Oscar Wilde. We know he's an Irish poet, and Wilde is best remembered for his epigram and plays. We know the Picture of Dorian Gray, where he has also published one, when he added in that publication one commentary, and that commentary was in about beauty, the art. So a criminal, and a little bit about him, as we know that a criminal conviction for gross indecency and consensual homosexual acts made him known as one of the first celebrity trials. So whilst parents were who? Anglo-Irish intellectual in Dublin, a young Wilde learned to speak fluent French. All about him, you can read it some. And John Ruskin and Walter Pater, 2 of his tutor, led the emerging philosophy of aestheticism. Fine. And we have the decay of lying. Actually, it was here that he talked about the art. So it is a Socratic dialogue, exactly written like a republic. Between this conversation is between Vivian and Cyril. Remember this character, that it promotes Wilde's view of romanticism over realism. Right, and the decay of lying is what? As an art, a science, and a social pleasure. So Vivian defends. So it was Vivian who defends aestheticism and art for art's sake. Right, and the essay appears in a collection of essays published in 1891 entitled Intentions. Okay, this was appears in collection of. Right. So Vivian and Cyril, 2 characters named after Wilde's sons, and engage in Socratic dialogue throughout the essay. And they talk about what? Vivian defends aestheticism, and Cyril was what he was talking about an article he has been written entitled The Decay of. So actually Vivian informs Cyril about an article that he has been writing, The Decay of Lying, a protest. So Vivian believes that the decay of lying as an art, a science, and a social pleasure has contributed to the decline of human. So, in his word, if something cannot be done to check or at least to modify our monstrous worship of fact, art will become sterile and beauty will pass away from the land. Anyway, the other conversation is also there. We have Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle, we know him for French Revolution and his lecture on heroes, remember? And he also wrote Life of Friedrich Schiller. We know that he's from Scotland and he was the leading writer of the Victorian era. And again, his innovative writing style is known as Carlyle's. And his style influenced Victorian literature and anticipated the technique of postmodern literature. So, symbol, clothes, that too is important for literary criticism. This too, say Carlyle rejected all ism. He said there is no ism. So he rejected all ism kind of thing. He believed that man could not fully know the true nature of God. In an 1835 letter, he asked, "Who dares name him? I dare not, and I do not." He rejected the charge of pantheism and expressed the empirical basis of his belief. So Carlyle saw all things as symbols or clothes representing the eternal infinite. We have J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, and why we know him? Because of he wrote What is Poetry? What is Poetry, which was published in 1833 by Stuart Mill, and as we know, he's an English philosopher, political economist, member of parliament, and so many things. Anyway, so he advocated what? Utilitarianism. So that term is quite important. A theory of ethics developed by his predecessor, Jeremy Bentham. And his contribution to the scientific methodology was significant. Auguste Comte, William Wayman, and we have John Herschel are among those who influenced him. That doesn't matter. What matters, John Stuart Mill wrote What is Poetry. And what he discussed there, he added two theoretical essay on poetry and title, What is Theory? The other was The Two Kinds of Poetry. That is very important. They only ask the name there. But if they won't, in exam I'm talking about. So if in the exam they would want to make a little bit more difficult about the question, they might ask about what is inside. But you only have to remember the name of the poet, what name of the work or critical work that he has written, and what he wrote, What is Poetry, and the two kinds of poetry. And John Stuart Mill explained the difference between rhetoric and poetry using antithesis in his essay What is Poetry? Rhetoric is heard, poetry is overheard. He said rhetoric can be heard, but poetry is overheard. Said that two things. And he argues that poetry is not a matter of fact or science. Poetry purpose is to act upon the emotions. So the interest felt in a novel and is derived from the incident. Other thing also he talked about Ralph Waldo Emerson. As we know about that, he was talking about mainly about freedom and all, right? So why he is important? Because he has written the poetry, The Poet. We know him. His well-known essays are Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, Circle, The Poet, and Experience Together with the Nature. So these all that he has written. So nature was one of his important philosophical essay where he talked about transcendentalism. Okay, and he delivered a speech, The American Scholar, that Oliver Wendell Holmes considered America's intellectual declaration of independence. So he usually talk about the original thoughts and all. Know that every American, because at that time, as I told you, they were more nationalist. So they were promoting their own original thoughts than the what we are influenced. I mean, they are influenced from European literature and all, right? So he published two collection, first series and second series. Anyway, we talk about the poet. What he talked about there: man of poetic talents actually, are industry and a skill in meter, but of the true poet. So throughout the essay, Emerson asserts that the human being is inherently incomplete, since he is only half himself. The other half is his expression, right? He also says poet is a man of beauty. Poet uses and to the general aspects of art in the present time. So the poet Emerson expresses the need for new and unique poet for United States. As I told you, more like nationalist. Anyway, so the essay was instrumental in publishing what? Walt Whitman's first collection of poetry, Leaves of Grass. Edgar Allan Poe, as we know that he is like the master of kind of unity of affects. So people always talk about no the unity of action, unity of time and other things, but he in his work he mentioned the unity of what effect you get from reading a particular work or literature or anything. So he makes unity of all that. And the best tale, and it is also one of my favorite, is The Murders in the Row Morgue, and that is 1841. It is a detective story and created in atmosphere unmatched in American literature. There is one video in YouTube that you can watch. It's so beautiful. Anyway, is The Raven is one of the very important or the best known national literature poem, and he presented his literary theories in his criticism, such as the poetic principle. That's why we have mentioned here in criticism. So anyway, The Raven, and they say the philosophy of composition, and claims to have strictly followed this method. It has been questioned whether he followed this system. However, T.S. Eliot said, "It is difficult for us to read that essay without reflecting that if Pope plotted out his poem with such calculation, he might have taken a little more pains over it. And the result hardly does credit to the method." Right? And the poetic principle that we're talking about, where he a couple of things that he said, the unity of effects, and he also talked about that poetry should be written for the poem's sakes, not for the art's sake. So that you should, and it is actually lecture gave toward the end of his life. Okay, and now we have Matthew Arnold, very important. Let me see. Not much. I think we can finish this in this class itself. So Matthew Arnold, we'll just move to the important points. So as we know, Matthew Arnold, we consider him poet critic, right? And Matthew Arnold also wrote extensively on social, religious and cultural issues and education, and he was born into a distinguished English family, and his father was a renowned headmaster of rugby. That's why he became a police officer, right? An inspector, school inspector. So anyway, he became the first Oxford professor of poetry to give lecture in English rather than in Latin. And Walt Whitman said about him that called him a literary dude. So Arnold's poetry has also had a strong influence. He is often recognized as one of the first poets to demonstrate a genuinely modern perspective in his work. So, the first major critical work of Matthew Arnold is The Study of Poetry, which was published in 1880. So remember, I'm just going to mention important points, important keywords that you have to remember, and that you will certainly will get at least one or two questions based on Matthew Arnold. One, they have started asking about his cultural work, and also one you will definitely get about the study of poetry, right? So Arnold explores poetry's high destiny and acknowledge that mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. So that was the initial acknowledgement in this study of poetry by Arnold. So he describes that the science and philosophy will ultimately prove flimsy and unstable. Like I said, no, in Renaissance criticism, Philip Sidney, no, put poetry above all the forms of literature, and here Matthew Arnold also says the same, that these science and philosophy will ultimately prove flimsy and unstable, and what poetry would remain the important. So the purpose of Arnold's essay is to establish a high standard, strict judgment, to avoid the mistakes of overvaluing certain poems and poets. So it applies a method for distinguishing what only the best and therefore classic poets. So he mentioned Milton. That question they have asked in previous year, not previous, I mean the last one that we took, I think second shift or the first shift. So remember that Milton, Shakespeare, Dante and Homer. So the best and therefore classic poet. He mentioned who are the classic poet in classic example of like poets are Milton, remember the name Milton, Shakespeare, Dante and Homer. So Arnold says that how their poetry is timeless and moving. And here, just pay attention for that. In Arnold's view, sincerity and feeling are paramount, as is the seriousness of the subject. So high seriousness he talked about, and he said the high seriousness can be found where? In Milton, Shakespeare, Dante and Homer, right? So the superior character of truth and seriousness in the matter and the substance of the best poetry is inseparable from the superiority of diction and movement, marking its style and manner. So in Arnold's view, Geoffrey Chaucer is indispensable poet. So he didn't count Geoffrey poet as high seriousness, right? So Chaucer does not fall under the classic also, and he lacks what? High seriousness. So that question it will come. So that is the backbone of the argument in the poem, so that you should remember. Chaucer does not come in high seriousness, he lacks, and he is not a classical poem according to him. And Arnold considers that poetry is as a criticism of life, rebuting Plato's charge that there are three types of estimation: the real estimate, the historical estimate and the personal estimate. So Arnold discusses the idea of imitation. He also talked about idea of imitation. According to him, whatever one reads or knows keeps coming back to him. He also, in the same essay, he introduces the term the touchstone analysis method. So this method is borrowed from Longinus, who said that if an example of sublimity can be pleasing to anyone regardless of habit, taste or age, and can be pleasant at any time, this is an example of sublime. So Arnold discusses Thomas Gray, after John Dryden and Alexander Pope. So despite writing little, Gray's poems are highly regarded, and Arnold regards Thomas Gray as classic. So according to Arnold, Thomas Gray and his poem is what? Classic. He is a classic poet. So according to Arnold, Robert Burns composed better poetry in Scottish than English, and Burns, like Chaucer, is not considered a classic. Again, Who? So he said that who are not the classical poet Burns and Chaucer. And Arnold then talked about Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth without judging their poetry. So Arnold acknowledged that his passion will influence his estimate of these poets as they are closer to his age than the classics. So their writings are more personal. Arnold concludes by discussing the preservance of classics. Again, touchstone method is what it is. Arnold compares classical example with other poems to determine whether they meet the high standard of the classic. So, according to him, the poems need not be similar to the touchstones. If the critic has formulated the touchstones in his mind to detect high poetic quality, he will not be able to find it in other poetry comparing to the touchstones. So Arnold quotes who? That question was also there. Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton. They all have a high poetic quality, high seriousness also. A critic does not, and also he considered them as classic. A critic does not need to struggle in vain to explain the importance of poetry. A few examples of poetry of the highest quality will suffice. According to Arnold, the high quality of poetry is determined by its matter manner. And he follows Aristotle's observation and says that the best form of poetry comprises truthfully and seriousness. Arnold points out that the real strength of this method lies in its application. He encourages critics to evaluate poetry using the touchstone method. Another work was The Function of Criticism, 1865, quite important. And Arnold begins his essay of literature of France and Germany as one of the intellect of Europe. So here Arnold explains the primary task of any critic. So critics must see any object work as it without considering other factors. So critics should always interpret the text how as a whole and never look to the other text. Okay, so according to Arnold, the creator of a text is more significant than its critic, since creative activity is the true function of a man. So a great literary work is produced by the power of man, and the power of movement. The absence of any of them will prevent the creation of great work of literature. And in his essay, also Arnold provides the example of two poets, Gade and Byron. So that is also important, where in the function of criticism. So Gade and Byron both possessed a great deal of productive power. However, the works of Gade are more valuable than those of Byron due to the former rich cultural background. Again, one of the important things, according to Arnold, Shakespeare did not have a deep reading habit. His fame and glory are primarily due to the climate of great ideas during his time. So he argues that the French Revolution, with its writers such as Rousseau and Voltaire, was more powerful than the English Revolutionary under Charles. Right? And the French Revolution was followed with the epoch of concern. Another term that we usually get is the use of disinterestedness. What does it mean? It means the practical view of things. Know the best that is known and thought in the world, and in its turn making this known to create a current of true and fresh ideas. So in these lines he provides a threefold explanation of responsibility of a critic. A critic must know about life, the first thing, and the world before writing anything, and see things as they are. A critic should convey his ideas, other to strive to ensure that the best ideas prevail in society. A critic must create an atmosphere for developing noble, honest, and true ideas to create the future's genius. Again, another work is Culture and Anarchy, and Culture is Anarchy, an essay on political and social capitalism. Remember the date, 1869, and the preface was actually added in 1859, 69, same date. Anyway, he says culture is a study of perfection. He wrote, culture seeks to do away with classes to make the best that has been thought and known in the world current everywhere, to make all men live in an atmosphere of sweetness and lightness. So that they asked, sweetness and light is, where did they mention? It was where, who coined this sweetness and light? Matthew Arnold. Where it was mentioned? Culture and Anarchy. And his often quote phrase is, culture is the best which has been thought and said. Remember that quote. I think there was also based on one question based on that too. So comes from the preface to Culture and Anarchy. So this essay is primarily concerned with recommending culture as an excellent tool for overcoming our current challenges. Remember some term which was mentioned in the Culture and Anarchy. Culture, remember the first work, if you can talk about culture studies, that was Matthew Arnold's. Then we have sweetness and light, barbarian, Philistine, and Hebraism. Hippolytine, only you have to remember the name, and why? Because she wrote history of English literature, and also that was the backbone of Virginia Woolf. I think The Room of Her Own or another one. So anyway, all feministic word usually based on history of English literature. Hippolytine, what he talk about, determinism of scientific thought. For him, a work could be explained in terms of. So Friedrich Nietzsche, we only know for he said that the God is dead. As we know, he's a German classical scholar and philosopher and critic of culture. We know him for The God is There and The Birth of the Tragedy. Here he talked about birth of the tragedy from the spirit music. Why Nietzsche is important? Because of Hellenism and pessimism. The later edition contained what? An introductory essay called An Attempt to Self-Criticism. And the former represents measure, restraint and harmony, unbridled passion, Socratic rationalism, optimism, spelled the death of Greek tragedy. Leo Tolstoy we know of because of War and Peace, Anna Karenina, right? And he won Nobel Peace Prize in 2000. He was nominated for that, and he was nominated Nobel Prize. The fact that he never won a significant controversy. He was born in an aristocratic Russian family. In 1828, Tolstoy notably wrote these works, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, some other semi-autobiographical trilogy, you can say, Childhood, Boyhood, Youth. Again, we have Sevastopol sketches. He has written dozens of short stories like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Family Happiness, After the Ball, Haji Murad. What is poetry? That's why he is famous in literary criticism. What is art? Is actually a book by Leo Tolstoy where he talks about what discusses the time, effort, public funds and public respect spent on art, artists, along with the imprecision of general opinion. So according to him, it is difficult to say what is meant by art, and especially what is good, usual art, art for sake, or art for the sake of which we might condone such sacrifice as are being offered at its shrine. Unremitting moralism, remember that Tolstoy and willingness to, including Wagner, Shakespeare, and Dante. Tolstoy rejects using what beauty to define art as anything that communicate emotions. To view this view of art is inclusive jokes, home decoration, church services are all considered art as long as they convey a sense of emotion. So that's done. We have finished Victorian criticism. Tomorrow we will talk about Marxism. That is, you see, it's so big, but it is not. We'll just mention important terms and all, and then we'll finish that Marxist literary theory or criticism, and then later we'll have anyway, that is a big. We have total how many pages? 251 pages, right? We have to 251 pages, and we need to finish this in 4 to 5 days. So that is all. Tomorrow we are going to talk about Marxist literary theory. So be there. We'll try to finish. Anyway, thank you so much. Bye bye, and have a good night.